Okay, we are back again with Kevin McAleer in our weekly chat on literature. And we have done 5 sessions, I believe, on Jack London, 1 on his novels, and 4 on short story, his four of his Klondike short story collections. We might go do the Hawaii short story collection sometime in the future. But in the meantime, Kevin has told us that the greatest story of all for Jack London is the life he lived. And I just read last night in prepping for this that H.L. Mencken said that quote, that his life was his best story of all, something like that. So let's delve into the man behind the literature, Jack London. Kevin, what do you have to say about Jack London's life, and where would you like to start in this discussion?
He's the first American writer as a man of action. Now, I say American because there were plenty non-American writers who were men of action. We can just start with Cervantes, Battle of Lepanto, something like that. You know, we can go back much beyond that, I'm sure. But anyway, first American author who was a real man of action, I would argue. At least that was his publicity, which helped sell his books. And he was very, he's a good-looking guy, photogenic. And as I talked about in an earlier video, I think he was the template for Hemingway.
Okay.
So that's the first thing I think of when I think of Jack London. I remember when I was a kid and I would hear his name, I would get a shiver up my spine of excitement, or see his name written, Jack London. I would get a little, I would get excited. There was a visceral excitement just hearing or reading his name.
What was that?
And because I knew a bit about his life at that point, I think it had to do with it.
What was Jack London a pseudonym, or was that his actual name?
Well, that was his actual name. He was born January 12th, 1876, the American centennial year. And we'll just take it to the end. He died November 22nd, 1916, just short of 41 years old. He was born out of wedlock to Flora. Her name escapes me. Help me out at any point. But his mother, Flora Wellman, and his mother had a relationship with an itinerant astrologer by the name of William Cheney. And when she got pregnant, he took off, and Jack was born without a father, a birth father, although he without a birth father present, let's put it that way. Shortly thereafter, Flora married a gentleman named John London, I believe his first name was, and that's where he got the London. And John London was a Civil War veteran and a farmer. He took up farming for a while. Later on, I think he fell on hard times and he became some kind of a caretaker or night watchman or something. And they had a very penurious life from the very beginning. And Jack had to work as a very young boy to support the family. I mean, really to support the family. It wasn't just like, me getting a paper route at 12 so Kevin can have some pocket money. This was him going out to work in factories and selling papers, being a newsboy, but bringing the money back home to Flora, his mother.
So he got the name London, the surname London, from his foster father, but
right.
And his original name was Jack. That was his baptismal name.
Yeah, that's pretty well that's pretty well established that it was this Cheney fellow. When Jack was about 20 years old or so, he got wind of this fellow's whereabouts. He was out in the Midwest or somewhere, I think, where he hailed from. And he wrote him and asked him if he was his father. And Cheney, kind of the confidence man he was, he ducked the question, said, well, you know, when I was with your mother, I was impotent. Nice out, right? I was impotent during that period. I could not be your father. Well, it's pretty clear that he was his father. And in fact, just through the certain characteristics that Jack had, this Cheney fellow was, you know, a very intelligent guy, apparently, and was a polymath, very Catholic, small c in his interests. And so was Jack. And he also had an interest in, obviously, the stars, the Star Rover later, in spiritualism, which he also got from his mother. His mother, you know, was a spiritualist. And so there are certain inherited traits in Jack that we can see from, if we wanted to impute them to him, from Mr. Cheney.
So I get where he got the name London, but so Jack is his regular name, or because, you know, like John F. Kennedy is called Jack Kennedy. Yeah. So is his actual name John? I'm just curious.
I'm not sure. He did not get that from John London, his foster father. He had been assigned his name at birth. I think it was John, but I could be wrong. I don't know.
Okay.
But it's a good name on the marquee, Jack London.
You're right. However he got that name, it sounds good, and I can understand the shiver up your spine, especially if you know a few of the stories he's written.
Well, that's the reason I got the shiver. I mean, Jack London in and of itself is not necessarily going to give you that shiver, but Jack, of course, is a very American two-fisted guy kind of name.
Yeah.
So that in itself helps.
Okay, and was he born and raised in San Francisco, Oakland? How did that work out?
Yeah, Oakland was basically where he was raised. And there's now a Jack London Square in Oakland, so they lay claim to him.
And there must be, I think there's a life-size statue of him in Jack London Square.
Oh, is there? I haven't been there, unfortunately. Have you?
No, but I did a virtual tour of Jack London Square, like a 30-minute virtual tour on it. I'll send you the link to that.
Okay. But it's actually neither here nor there, because at a very young age, he was roaming all about the Bay Area.
Yeah.
And I think John London, his foster father, had a farm in Alameda in those first years. So Jack was a real, you know, Californian, or Northern Californian. He roamed all about, and then, you know, at a very young age, 12, 13, 14, I think it was 14 maybe, he got his first skiff and started sailing around San Francisco Bay, and then he became an oyster pirate. Oyster pirate, for those who don't know, oysters were farmed on the shores of San Francisco Bay. And, you know, at night, you would have guys coming and just robbing them. And he got in that business. And then he switched sides after about 3 months, after he realized it was kind of risky. And he joined the Fish Patrol. And that's to catch the oyster pirates, among others, salmon pirates, oyster pirates, all the other illegal activities that were going on there. So he was sailing all around San Francisco Bay. And I mean, he was hanging out with, you know, real hard-boiled characters from a very young age, going into saloons on the Barbary Coast, you know, famous or infamous for its bars and brothels and casinos, opium dens, right? This is where he got his upbringing, okay? So this is where the man of action, the adventurous life of Jack London starts. For lack of a better word, that's probably the best word. That's where it really kicks off.
Okay. So that's how long was he in that area of the state before he went off on his first non-California adventure, let's say. Was the Klondike the first time he went
No,
afar?
no. At 17, he signed on as a able-bodied seaman with the Sophia Sutherland, which was what they called a sealer. They were going up to the Bering Sea to hunt seals for
Oh,
their furs. And so and he actually joined that, apparently, he joined that expedition, the crew of the Sophia Sutherland, because he realized that the life he was leading, at a certain point, he joined a gang and was like, mugging people and stuff, and and drinking quite a lot. And he realized that this life was a dead end, and he had to make a break and get out of there. And he was an accomplished sailor in his own right, so he decided, okay, good, I'll use what I have at my disposal, and I'll hop a ship and you know get out of here. And it was about a half-year voyage, and came back, and that was his first adventure outside of San Francisco Bay.
okay. And is he starting to write during all these ventures? Oyster
Right,
Pirate, Sealer?
indeed. When he came, by the way, this whole time he's reading. So from a very young age, he was a great reader. So between between mugging Chinamen on the Barbary Coast with his little gang, or robbing oyster beds, or going out with the fish patrol, he was always reading. He talks about that in John Barleycorn, among other
Martin
places.
Eden. Martin Eden.
I mean, yeah, he's constantly reading. So uh,
Who,
he
who,
had a literary bent. The first story he actually wrote and had a great success with was, he came back from this expedition to the Bering Strait, and there was a competition in one of the local papers when he got back to San Francisco / Oakland, and his mother encouraged him to write a story and enter the competition. And he wrote it about a typhoon off the coast of Japan, I think, and it won first prize. So that's this tour de force, Mr. London. There's no stopping him. First real story he writes. He was probably scribbling around with other stuff, but first formal story apparently that he wrote and then submitted for publication. It not only gets published in the paper, but it wins a prize. 17 years old.
okay. And he's a big reader. So who are his formative influences in his literary path?
Well, he tells us, and we've talked about it already. Kipling, of course. I think even primarily would be Kipling.
I think Joseph Conrad must be one of them as well, from what I've
Yeah,
read.
although I don't think he talks about him much as a formative influence. Conrad didn't really hit the scene big until the aughts, until the first decade of the 20th century.
Oh, okay.
He'd been writing stuff,
Yeah,
and of course, Heart of Darkness was 1899 or 1900. But we're still talking about the early to mid 1890s with London at this point, okay?
I got you. I got you.
Right. So whereas Kipling had established himself by the late 1880s and early 1890s, and London would have not only gotten wind of him, but would have had access to his books in the Oakland Public Library. By the way, a fun fact, also in Oakland at this time was Gertrude Stein.
Mm.
I always like to imagine Gertrude Stein and Jack London crossing paths in the Oakland Library, checking out books. Two different characters you could not possibly imagine, but that is the link between London and Hemingway, a real living link.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's a little side note. So there, of course, I think he also has started reading, I'm not sure, but Herbert Spencer and maybe Darwin and Nietzsche. I'm not sure. Maybe it's a little early for that for him. I know he actually, by the time he went to the Klondike, he was reading those guys.
Yes. Okay.
Marx forming his Weltanschauung.
Okay, let's talk about the Klondike. So when does he go there, and how long does he stay? When does he come back?
Well, he does lots of things in between the Sophia Sutherland trip. He goes across America, riding the rails. He's a tramp, hobo. Ends up in the penitentiary in New York State, there for 30 days. Writes about that in his great and underrated, not even known, in large part, his great novel or memoir/memoir, The Road. Writes about his adventures there. He also does a lot of he's doing a lot of manual labor that will later come into play in Martin Eden. He writes about that in Martin Eden, and how that really helped to make him a socialist. Just the hours and the drudgery and the cheap wages, barely enough to live on, but you had no other choice. So these years between 17 and 21, when he then goes up to the Klondike, 1897, those are formative years in terms of his recognizing the fact that he is a socialist. He wants what the working class wants. They want,
And you said
greater
before
equality. They want, maybe even the classless society, a la Marx. But we need reform. We need probably even revolution. And he's for the working man. That's where his sympathies are.
and you said in an earlier discussion, earlier video, that he didn't know the horrors of socialism/Marxism, of the Russian Revolution or of the Pol Pot.
Well, no one did.
So
not.
to him, it seemed like a completely benign thing to be at the time.
Yeah, relatively speaking. He knew that there had to be violence. I mean, he was calling for revolution till the very end, until the day that he left the Socialist Party. He wrote a formal letter withdrawing his membership from the Socialist Party just a few months before his death. And his argument was that they had become a tame revisionist party. And he wanted them to become, not to be domesticated that way, like by capitalist society. He wanted them to keep the revolutionary faith. And
so did he actually
blow it all over and burn it all down? He was a wild-eyed socialist.
Wow, kind of on the level of a Trotsky or a Lenin, perhaps?
Yeah, it's interesting. What's kind of sad, just for us who are interested in his life, is if he had lived just one more year, he could have experienced the Russian Revolution, and we would have gotten
over. He might have gone over there to report on it.
Maybe
like John Reed.
He knew John Reed, of course. They all knew each other, pretty much. Emma Goldman, he knew Emma Goldman. She came from San Diego. They were all tight. Yeah.
Imagine the movie Reds featuring Jack London in the middle of it. That would have been interesting.
Yeah. Who do you get to play him, though? Because he was a matinee idol in his own way. I mean, just women talk about it. It's not just looking at the pictures. They talk about what an attractive, masculine, just handsome man he was. And you see that. So anyone playing him could have only been a disappointment for me.
Do you have any actors you would suggest that could have played him, like Russell Crowe or Leonardo DiCaprio?
Russell Crowe, don't mention him in the same breath with Jack London.
What about Brad Pitt?
He's a shapeless oaf. I wouldn't argue no talent, but I'm not a Russell Crowe fan. I think this guy is just the most overrated actor of all time.
How about Brad Pitt playing Jack London? A young Brad Pitt might have done it.
Maybe, yeah. Let's not get off on this tangent. I know you mean well, Tim, but that's depressing to even think about Hollywood actors in the same mental breath with Jack London, who's the real deal.
All right.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll move on from that.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got some of his influences in literature. We see how he's knocking around the Bay Area. Did he ever make it down to your neck of the woods, Southern California, Los Angeles, Long Beach, in his various travels?
Later on, when Hollywood started to buy up the rights to his books, and he would have business down there occasionally, and for other reasons, he didn't care for Los Angeles, I have to say. But that's typical. It's the old antipathy between Northern and Southern Californians, right? Between San Franciscans and Angelinos, right? And whatever. But that's the way it was. He hated New York most of all, though. He just really detested New York, and I share that antipathy with him.
You're not a fan of New York?
So yeah, we're united in that dislike. The Northern and the Southern Californian, we're united in our dislike of New York. He disliked it.
Kind of a California.
He found it squalid and dirty, and these canyons of Wall Street, where all the high finance manipulation takes place. As a good socialist, he's not going to candy to that scene. And he was a true Californian. We can talk about this maybe at the end, but he was a true Californian in the sense that he didn't need approval from the East Coasters. He didn't need approval from New York. He needed them to publish his books, sure, but he wasn't going to kiss up to them. He didn't do that at all. And what's that?
Interesting.
Yeah. Unlike many of his contemporaries in San Francisco, like George Sterling and a couple of others whose names escape me, but they eventually moved to New York. Even if had he lived to be 100 years old, he would have never moved to New York. He had his beauty ranch in Glen Ellen, Sonoma County, which I visited, which we can maybe talk about. That came a little bit later in his life. But no, he was a tried and true Californian. The adventure path, which is what he called his own life. And California was the promise of the future. He was a very proud Californian. All that Pacific Rim just, opening out in front of you as you gaze westward. Unlimited opportunity, and the whole idea that America is the land where immigrants invent themselves. Actually, they will use the term to reinvent themselves, but I like to argue you can only reinvent after you've invented yourself. And the real place where the reinventions took place for Americans, they land in, like our kith and kin, the McAleers. They land in Youngstown, Ohio, and then they take off for Los Angeles. And some guy who's been working in the Youngstown steel mills becomes mayor of Los Angeles, whom you are named after, Timothy Owen McAleer, 1904 to 1906. That's a reinvention, if there ever was one, okay, being immigrants from Ireland. So that was what Jack was all about with California. That was the land of opportunity, right? You want to escape the East, this squalid, industrialized, grimy, dirty, ugly, citified part of the country, and get out to California where you can really spread your wings and fly. So that's my affinity to him, as you can probably tell through my enthusiastic rendering of what made him such a Californian. And I have no love lost for New York.
Okay, so he sees California as kind of the last frontier of the move west, but then he broadens that last frontier. Where do you go after you've gone to the edge of the world, California? You can go to another edge of the world, another frontier, which is Alaska, or even Hawaii might count as another frontier that has yet to been explored in great depth, at least by the white man.
Or even Samoa, or Tahiti, where he also went. That was 1907, I believe, with his Snark. He built this boat, and he was a good sailor, but he had done most of his sailing, where he was like the captain or the master of the ship, along the coast, right? So now you're heading out into the depths of the Pacific, and hopefully you won't descend to the depths of Davy Jones' locker, right? And there were many times on that trip, the voyage of the Snark, which he took with his then wife, Charmian Kittredge. Charmian London, he married her, of course, if she's going to be his wife. There were many times when they were on the verge of dying. Okay.
Really?
And well, the boat was very poorly fashioned. It was his own design, but it didn't work too well. At a certain point, the guy who was supposed to be the navigator on the boat, he didn't know how to navigate, so Jack read a book and learned it. Typical Jack London, in the clutch. He goes to a book, he reads it, figures it out, he can navigate. And they landed in Hawaii, eventually down there to Tahiti, as I mentioned. So exploring the Pacific in his very own boat, of his very own design.
It sounds like he's an apostle or a disciple of the Emerson Thoreau self-reliant philosophy.
Yeah, here's a passage I want to read. I was hoping I'd save it, be able to save it for the end, but it's an appropriate moment now. This is a book about Jack London called Sailor on Horseback. It's by Irving Stone. You know Irving Stone. We all know Irving Stone.
He wrote Lust for Life and Agony and Ecstasy about the great artist. Yeah.
Among others, and those are his two famous ones, but this is also a very good book. This is one of the first biographies ever written of London. And in the 1930s, I think, Irving Stone himself was from Southern California, I think San Diego. Anyway, he talks about this idea of London and being a Californian. If I just can read a passage here, this might be helpful. With his life, he was painting a portrait of a native Californian, that unusual specimen of humanity indigenous to the soil of the state, to be found nowhere else in the same form. A modest megalomaniac, like most native Californians, he was simple, genuinely unpretentious with his friends and associates about his success and accomplishments, but to himself fiercely sure, positive. Like most native Californians, he was robust, hearty in manner, with strong physical appetites, worshiping the beauty, strength, skill, and pleasures of the body, which in turn led him to admire the arts and the fruits of culture. He was childlike in his desire to play, important, play as a value, fun as a value in California. He was childlike in his desire to play, to have fun. Above all, he wanted to laugh, not gently or delicately, but uproariously. Like most native Californians, he was informal. He never wore a stiff collar. They were wearing these very stiff starch collars back then, and these very similar ties. And he always had a soft collar, like a modern day man. It was very soft, low on the neck, with a very, lightly tied tie. He was informal, hated starchy people and starchy ideas and preconceived prejudices, was intolerant of the bonds of tradition, enjoyed being a vigorous iconoclast. Like most Californians, he wanted to do everything at the top of his might: work, play, laugh, love, relax, conquer, create. Like most native Californians, he thought himself a pioneer, a trailblazer, a creator of a new and better civilization. Since everything around him was so strong and so vast and so rich, he had boundless confidence in himself, positive that everything that sprang from the California soil was the greatest on earth. Okay, so modest megalomania. Anyway, quite an encomium. And I think I agree with a lot of that. He basically pulled out all the stops and said, London and California is all things to all men, but I think he hit on a few good points there. Maybe our listeners can pick up on a few and say, yeah, I think that sounds right.
That's a biography on London by Irving Stone.
Yeah, it's very good.
You read it?
Oh yeah, I've read it a couple of times. It's good.
Do you recommend any other books on his life, if any?
Well, I have one right here as a reference, in case I needed it. It's Jack London, A Life by Alex Kershaw. He's a Brit. And the Brits always do a good job in Americans because they have that distance, and they write very well too, I would argue. Sometimes better than our own.
And any other books besides the Irving Stone and the?
There's one I read very young. It's called Jack. I forget the author though, but that was one of the first biographies I read about him. It was published in 1976, the centennial of his birth, the bicentennial of our nation. I forget the author of that, but that was very good too.
Okay, and you mentioned Charmian, his wife. Did he have only one wife in his life, or
no? There have been books written on his relationship to women. In fact, one of them, which is good, it's by Clarice Stotz, Stazz, I believe, and it's basically Jack London and his women. And his first wife, well, let's just put it this way. I mean, he was introduced to the world of womanhood there, on the Barbary Coast, very young. Okay, by genteel San Francisco standards, very young indeed. Okay, he married at the age of 24, and he married a woman whose name was Bess Maddern, I believe, or Madden or Maddern. I think it's Maddern with an R. And the unusual thing about this marriage is that it wasn't a love match. He was not in love with her, and he told her so. That's the even more unusual thing. He wanted to breed beautiful children with her, and he thought that she's a sturdy, robust Anglo-Saxon type. They could make nice kids together. That was his game plan. And of course, she was so in love with him that's like, oh yeah, sure, yeah, he'll learn to love me, and anyway, I love him, and let's do it, right? So they got married, and they had two daughters, Becky and Bess, I think was one of the daughters, her nickname at least. And after a couple years, Jack left her for Charmian Kittredge. After more than a couple of years. I mean, the marriage hung on for 3 or 4 years. It wasn't just that he had never been in love with her. And one of the reasons he married her was that in 1900, he in fact married her on the day that his first book of short stories was published. Now, think about that. He's got a long game here, right? And he even gave voice to that long game by saying he needed the stability of marriage to be productive, to get his writing done, his 1,000 words a day, which was what the goal he set for himself. And he rarely varied from that.
And that first collection was called The Son of the Wolf, right?
Son of the Wolf, right. And he knew that there was a wild man inside him still, right, which would break out occasionally. Yeah, it would, especially with the drinking and with the women. Still got in the occasional fist fight. He was not ready to be tamed quite yet, but he knew that he needed her as a break on him so that he could maintain some manner of discipline. He knew this. He said it. But okay, good. The marriage sounds like it was doomed to failure, and it was. And again, a few years later, he left Bess for Charmian Kittredge, who was a very liberated woman. She was 5 years older than him. Liberated. Oh, she worked as a secretary, I think, at the Overland Monthly, where he published one of his first short stories, a local magazine. And she was more fun-loving. She wasn't the matronly type. She liked to do the things that Jack liked to do. She even like put on the boxing gloves and they would box, stuff like this, unheard of. She didn't ride side saddle. Women were still riding side saddle. She rode astride, boxed, drank with him, and so she kept up with him and the lifestyle he wanted to lead, and he loved her. He did indeed love her. That marriage had no issue. Charmian became pregnant twice. One was a miscarriage. The daughter was miscarried, and then another daughter died very shortly after the birth. So those were two disappointments that they had in their marriage, among others. But yeah.
Did he have relationships with other famous writers at all?
Yes, but I can't recall. There was one relationship he had. I don't know if they ever consummated it, but a woman named Anna Strunsky, and she was a Jewish socialist in Oakland or San Francisco in the Bay Area, and they became very close very early on. And in fact, they wrote a book together called The Wace-Kempton Letters. And it's in fact about Jack taking the side of marriage as a biological arrangement. You want to propagate the breed, and then Anna Strunsky taking the side of marriage based on love and romance and sentiment. Well, her side of the argument proved out with him. He did actually finally said, I can't do this anymore. I gotta leave Bess and marry Charmian. But Anna Strunsky is one of the famous ones. And she wrote a memoir later on after his death, writing very fondly of him. And she's one of those women that I alluded to earlier who wrote about the magnetism he exercised on women. He was a real magnet for women. So.
And did he have relationships or correspondence with other renowned socialists? Like, did he ever correspond with the Lenins and the Trotskys or any of the Russian heavy hitters?
No, I don't believe so. But Emma Goldman.
Oh.
She was from San Diego, believe it or not. And they got together. They knew each other well, and they had a correspondence, and they would have vicious arguments late into the night. Vicious but fun. Those kind of things.
I guess Emma Goldman's probably the most famous of the American socialists back then, huh?
I think so, or the most famous woman socialist worldwide, with maybe the exception of Rosa Luxemburg in Germany.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So we kind of covered the
So he had a thing for Jewish socialists.
Jewish female socialists, right?
Well, that's what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Well, I guess, socialism's often been popular with Jewish people, so he's naturally going to meet a lot of the people of that background.
Yeah, but I think there was even a little flirtation with Emma Goldman. That's what I'm alluding to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But yeah.
Okay. So he gets to the Klondike. Do you have anything specific to mention about his time there, or is it all in his stories and we just
not really? I think we pretty much talked that one through.
Anything we missed?
Not really. He didn't really do much prospecting. He didn't come up with much. He came up with $50 worth of gold, I think it was. Came home with that in his pants pocket. But he basically spent the whole winter because they got snowed in, and you can't prospect in the snow. You got like 4 or 5 months to do it in Alaska or the Klondike, and he spent that time in the cabin with several other guys in this very small space. And there's at least one report of what a good fella he was. He was always ready to lend a hand. He was very cheerful. He was very learned, well spoken, even at that young age. And he argued socialism, argued Darwinism, taught these guys a thing or two. Basically, unlettered men in that cabin, and he was reading all the time, but he was a good sport and a real trooper, as you might imagine. And he was a great sailor too. I mean, he sailed a boat to get to where you had to go to mine your gold, and then he sailed the boat back down the Yukon in the summer because I think he had scurvy. He had scurvy at a certain point, and he was in bad shape. And he and some other fellow, maybe another along with them, they sailed the boat down the Yukon to get out of there, go home. And that's where London, I remember this is like a real life account that he wrote down. That's where he talks about the incessant mosquitoes. Think about it, on the river in the summer up there, and how it was just brutal. You couldn't escape them unless you dove into the water.
They put mud packs on their face to alleviate that or something?
Apparently they put mud on their face or did whatever you had to do. I guess there weren't a lot of mosquito nets back then or mosquito repellent, so you made do.
Wow.
But anyway, he put his sailor experience to good use up
now,
there.
Speaking of the sailor experience, you talked about the voyage of the Snark and kind of his homemade boat, and he does a cruise around the world. Now, I was reading a little background on this last night. Apparently, there was another guy, I forget his name, who had done a circumnavigation of the globe, and
Joshua Slocum.
Yes, that was the first guy who did a solo.
Right.
So he wanted to follow in those footsteps.
A lone hander, yeah. Yeah, but he didn't trust himself to do that. So he took Charmian on this trip, and she was great. She was great because he got sick at a certain point. He took Charmian, and they had a crew of about 5 or 6. At a certain point, I think in Samoa or down there in Polynesia somewhere, he contracted all kinds of diseases of the skin and whatnot. I don't even know. But it was there or later in Australia where he went to recuperate because they abandoned the trip. The trip had been planned for around the world. Didn't mention that. It's been planned for around the world. They basically abandoned it in Australia because he was incapacitated with all these tropical diseases. And it was there, or even maybe a little bit earlier, that he started administering mercury to himself to help cure whatever disease or diseases he was suffering from. And one doctor in particular, one of our contemporary doctors, someone just rang the doorbell, forget it. He has written that London, in fact, died of mercury poisoning because he had been administering this to himself over years in order to cure himself of whatever diseases he had contracted down there. So
he thought mercury was a panacea, I guess, but it was the opposite.
Yeah. And so it wasn't because of syphilis, but some other thing that they cured or that you were supposed to cure with mercury.
Okay, and we've got about 15 more minutes, so we'll talk about his last years and his death and how he died. But is there any other things to mention about his life, his works, his relationships before we move on to the final years?
I don't know. The important thing to mention is that one of his great projects was his beauty ranch up in Glen Ellen. And as I said, I've been there. It is aptly named. It's gorgeous.
Well, where is Glen Ellen in relation to Oakland and San Francisco?
Sonoma County. It's sort of northeast of the Bay
Is it
Area.
closer to Sacramento then?
Is it? You know, I really don't know, but it's north of it. It's north and I think east of the Bay
Of the Bay
Area.
Area.
Yeah, and
How far out from the Bay Area? 30
oh, I don't,
miles?
I don't know, 50 miles maybe, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, um, and this was his sort of organic farming project, and he bought up a lot of land through all his royalties. I mean, he was quite a wealthy man, but the thing is, he was always giving his money away or investing it in projects that proved disastrous. And the beauty ranch was one of them. And it was good. It was beautiful. You know, he bred pigs and he grew. He planted thousands of eucalyptus trees. He grew this or that crop. He would try to renew the soil through modern farming techniques. He was one of the first ecological farmers. People often cite that as being one of his great contributions to, you know, conservationism.
Oh.
And he took particular pride in his beauty ranch. In fact, he said at one point that, you know, if he could just have his beauty ranch and have enough money to just run the beauty ranch without writing another word, then he would do it, because he'd worked hard all his life, and you know, he'd sort of written himself out at a certain point, I think, though his powers were still intact until the very end. Those Hawaii stories, you like them very much. A lot of them came out in his final years, but he was buying stories from people like Upton Sinclair, another socialist, to give him ideas, because he was great. His powers of expression were great, but he always said that his story, he didn't have a story mind necessarily, but you give him a story and he'll write it to death, baby. He's gonna put this one over. So yeah, he has this was actually his pet project, the Beauty Ranch.
And how old was he? What year did he get that ranch? And was he there to the end of his life?
Well, he added on to it. He was buying up acreage constantly, and this also depleted his purse. And I think about 1909, when he got back from the Snark voyage, he started investing in land and you know, kept adding on to it and expanding it and developing it until the day of his death in 1916.
And what did he die of?
Well, again, the death certificate is officially uremia, which
Uremia.
is basically a kidney disease where, you know, the urine doesn't get flushed, to use a unintentional pun, from the body, but it's sort of absorbed by the bloodstream and it poisons your system. So, you know, his drinking maybe exacerbated that. That's the official cause of death. May have been exacerbated by the two empty vials they found on the floor next to his bed of morphine.
We did talk in a previous video about whether there was an intention of suicide on his part, and you say, because I've heard some speculate on that in books I've read, but you say that you don't think that was what he was doing.
No, I don't. He had too great of a desire to see his various projects through to completion, the Beauty Ranch being one. He had book projects going. You know, it's not as if he had completely dried up. I said he didn't have a great story mind by his own admission. I don't know if that's true, but and he was planning books. He had been planning to see his daughters, you know, a few days later. He didn't see them very often. The mother basically kept them away from the beauty ranch because she didn't want to expose them to this woman, Charmian Kittredge. She thought she would be a bad influence. So he had been kind of alienated from his daughters, and he was looking forward to seeing them. There's a letter. It's one of the last letters he wrote. There's footage of him. You can find it on YouTube. A few days before his death, just a few days, maybe at most a week, where he's going around the beauty ranch. He's on his tractor, with his horse pulling it, and he's playing with his piglets, in his pig palace, he called it. It was of his own design, some revolutionary design. He's got a smile on his face. He was in great pain because of his chronic uremia and maybe mercury poisoning and whatever other ailments he was suffering from, because he had a lot. And he was under a lot of financial pressure because he was in great debt. He was always writing to keep up the bank balance, and he was very generous to a fault. Charmian would often get on his case, say, "You can't just give money away like that, Jack. Come on, you got to get so many people to support. Not only his ex-wife, but his two daughters, child support, and then his old nanny, his ex-slave, his Mammy Jenny, who had been his wet nurse when he was young, to whom he was absolutely loyal, and he supported her after his death with funds, and then in his will he was going to pay for her funeral. These sorts of things, right? And then and scores of other people. And then his own massive projects. We haven't even talked about Wolf House, which was this house he was building out of redwood and the local rock, and was going to be this castle of his, and then it burned down just shortly before its completion. It broke his heart, and they still have the ruins of it there, just a little bit further off in the forest from the locus of the beauty ranch, and it's heartrending because all the stone is perfectly in place, right? You see the structure perfectly, but then the redwood's just gone, and that broke his heart. And yeah, he had a lot of setbacks. And then a lot of people were saying he didn't have the same kick as he did when he was younger, his writing's going downhill. But despite that, he had a great conquering spirit. And I don't think he was a guy at that point in his life who would have done himself in. Maybe later on, he discusses it a lot. He talks about it a lot. He writes about it a lot. The relief that death will bring from the suffering in this life. So I'm not saying he would have never done it. He might have been a prime candidate for that kind of thing, but not at that stage.
Okay, good answer. Good, very good, thorough response on that. And now we have about 5 to 10 minutes left. The last question is, what is Jack London's legacy, in your opinion?
I would say he's the first great California writer.
Okay.
Was Frank Norris from California? I forget.
I think he was San Francisco, Frank Norris.
Okay, well, that's California. That's Jack London territory. But the first great California writer. And because he even preceded Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. I think Upton Sinclair was a California writer.
Well, another California writer, in a sense, is Mark Twain, because he comes out west. He writes Roughing It about being in San Francisco as a journalist, but he's a transplant and he's not here permanently, so he doesn't really count, right?
No. Nice try. Roughing It's a great.
But I do think Twain was an influence on London. He's one of the formative influences I don't think we've mentioned yet. Do you agree with that?
Perhaps, but he doesn't have Twain's humor, as we have established, I hope.
Yes.
London isn't funny. He can be wry, he can be ironic, but that's the extent of things. When he goes funny, it's a little bit flat. And as we've discussed, I'm not too amused by his attempts at Klondike stories.
In speaking of his legacy, let me just pose this question: is there an Ernest Hemingway without a Jack London? Is he somehow influential on someone like a Hemingway, or are there other writers who were influenced by him and his oeuvre?
Well, Hemingway, definitely. We discussed this already. I think, again, the man of action as writer, living out your own stories, or living your life and then taking from your life to write your stories. The two-fisted, manly man, outdoorsy guy who's also a very sensitive, expressive writer. Hemingway's almost a carbon copy in that way. And London was the first guy, for example, to write a bullfight story. It's called, what's it called? I got it right here. It's called The Madness of John Harness or something. I forget exactly. Anyway, I had it written down because people, The Madness of John Harned takes place in Ecuador. It's a bullfight story. It's a good one too. He was the first guy to really take boxing seriously as a theme. He wrote a number of boxing stories, A Piece of Steak, The Game, The Abysmal Brute. And Hemingway also had his own boxing stories, 50 Grand, The Battler. But London was the first guy to do that, to take boxing seriously as a literary theme. He also wrote an excellent story called The Mexican. It's about a Mexican kid, and he needs money. He wants to earn some money to help finance the Mexican Revolution by rifles, I guess, or ammo. And he goes in the boxing ring, and he wins, and he gets the money. It's a good story. It's more interesting than what I've described there. So he was the first guy to do that. He was the first guy to write about surfing, as you have mentioned, right? He didn't write about it in a fictional way necessarily. I just know his nonfiction treatments. But doing that sort of thing, so in that way, he's not only an influence on Hemingway, but other writers like Steinbeck or something.
Norman Mailer.
Norman Mailer, these guys who want to be more than just writers.
George Plimpton.
They want to be more than just liter. They want to be more than just members of the literati. They want to be considered men in their own right, which is a completely legitimate thing. I think they would have made great Romans, right? And so I think London set this up as being sort of the template that you aspire to as a certain kind of American writer.
Okay. I very good answer. All right, Kevin, we've reached the end. Any final words before we end the program here?
Again, we'll just end we'll end by reemphasizing this point. I think that for me, London, and it's my affinity I have to him, not that I have even 1/10 or 1/100th of his talent or his experience or his qualities, but I have a certain affinity to him in the sense that he's a California writer. Okay, that's it. And what does that mean, a California writer? It's this notion of the adventure path. Okay, he used that phrase himself. He said that his life is the adventure path. Now, we can't all be as adventurous as Mr. London, but the idea that you go out and live, and then you cull from your life to inform your fiction, and you do it with passion and energy, that for me is the value of Jack London. And I talked about being a Californian as reinventing yourself, right? It's the state, I think, in the global imagination, even where one can reinvent themselves, if anywhere. Well, talk about a guy who invented and reinvented and reinvented himself. That's Jack London.
All right.
He led multiple lives.
All right, Kevin, that's well stated, and a lot of good info in this chat. Next week, if we're able to, we may not be able to next week. I hope we can cover some of F. Scott Fitzgerald's life and career.
All right.
But thank you for this coda to our exploration of the literature of Jack London, and we'll see you next week or in 2 weeks.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Appreciate it.
Bye-bye now.